What if I told you that just 2 months after the world celebrated the end of the bloodiest conflict in human history, we came within days of plunging into a third world war that would have made everything that came before look like a mere prelude to Armageddon? And I'm not talking about some theoretical what-if scenario dreamed up by conspiracy theorists or alternate history novelists. I'm talking about a fully developed military operation complete with invasion dates, troop deployments, strategic targets, and even a code name that perfectly captured the audacity of what was being planned, Operation Unthinkable, a top-secret plan ordered by Winston Churchill himself on May 8, 1945, the very day the world was celebrating victory in Europe, while millions danced in the streets and kissed in Times Square, while families reunited and soldiers believed they were finally going home. One man sat in his war room looking at maps of Eastern Europe with a terrible realization gnawing at his conscience. And that realization was this: we had just defeated one totalitarian monster only to hand half of Europe to another, and the Polish people, for whose freedom Britain had ostensibly gone to war in the first place, were now disappearing into Soviet-occupied territory, their resistance leaders vanishing without a trace, their hopes for democracy crushed under Stalin's iron boot, and Churchill consumed by guilt and rage and a prophetic understanding of what Soviet domination would mean for the next half-century, did something that even today seems almost insane in its boldness. He ordered his military chiefs to draw up plans for a massive surprise attack against the Soviet Union scheduled for July 1st, 1945, just 7 weeks away, an operation that would involve British and American forces, Polish troops eager for liberation. And here's where it gets truly unthinkable: freshly surrendered German Wehrmacht divisions that would be rearmed and thrown back into battle, alongside the very armies they had been trying to kill just weeks before. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine British and American soldiers fighting shoulder to shoulder with Nazi troops against their former Soviet allies? And this wasn't some half-baked contingency plan sketched on a napkin. This was a fully detailed operational blueprint prepared by the Joint Planning Staff. They calculated that 47 Allied divisions would launch surprise assault in the area of Dresden, right in the middle of Soviet lines, hoping to drive Stalin's forces back beyond the Oder River and liberate Poland and East Germany. They knew the odds were staggering. The Soviets had 264 divisions in Europe compared to the Allies' 103. They outnumbered Allied forces more than 2 to 1 in infantry and had 36 armored divisions compared to the Allies' 23. The Red Army that had just crushed Hitler's Wehrmacht was now fully mobilized with 6.5 million troops on the German border alone, and these weren't the exhausted, demoralized German forces the Allies had been fighting. These were battle-hardened Soviet soldiers who had fought their way from Stalingrad to Berlin, who had endured unimaginable suffering and emerged victorious, who believed they were the true liberators of Europe. But Churchill was willing to risk it all. He was willing to gamble on a quick, decisive blow that would force Stalin back to the negotiating table, that would restore Poland's independence and prevent the Iron Curtain from descending across Europe. And for a few weeks in May and June of 1945, while the world celebrated peace, a small group of British and American military planners worked frantically on Operation Unthinkable, calculating logistics, planning invasion routes, estimating casualties, and preparing for a war that would have made World War II look like a warm-up act. But here's the question that should make your blood run cold. Why didn't it happen? What stopped Churchill from launching this operation? Was it wisdom? Was it cowardice? Was it the realization that the atomic bomb, which wouldn't be successfully tested until July 16th, wasn't yet ready? Or was it something else entirely? And here's an even more chilling question. Did Stalin know about Operation Unthinkable? Because in June 1945, just weeks before the planned invasion date, Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov suddenly ordered his troops in Poland to regroup and prepare for defensive action. Was this just coincidence, or had the Cambridge Five, that infamous ring of British spies, already passed Churchill's plans to Moscow? And if Stalin knew, what was he preparing? What countermeasures did he have in mind? Because let me tell you something. The documents that were finally declassified in 1998, 53 years after the fact, paint a picture of a world that came so close to total annihilation that it's genuinely terrifying. Churchill's own military chiefs concluded that a quick victory was impossible, that Any attack on the Soviet Union would result in protracted war against heavy odds, that Allied forces would be drawn deeper and deeper into Soviet territory until they faced a nightmare that had destroyed Napoleon and Hitler, a Russian winter campaign against an enemy fighting for its homeland. And the casualties, the estimates were staggering. They made D-Day look like a skirmish. We're talking about millions dead, entire cities destroyed, and this was before anyone fully understood what nuclear weapons could do, before Hiroshima and Nagasaki demonstrated the horrific power that would come to define the Cold War. So let me ask you this. What would our world look like today if Operation Unthinkable had gone forward? What if Churchill had given the order and those 47 divisions had crossed into Soviet-occupied territory on July 1st, 1945? Would we have won? Would Stalin have been forced to retreat? Or would we have stumbled into a third world war that would have consumed what was left of civilization? Would the atomic bomb have been used not on Japan but on Soviet cities? Would millions more have died in a conflict that could have lasted years? And here's the truly haunting part. Churchill believed he was making the right choice. He believed that stopping Stalin in 1945, while the West still had the military strength to do so, was better than allowing Soviet domination to spread unchecked across Europe. And looking at what followed, the Berlin airlift, the Korean War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the decades of Cold War tension that brought us to the brink of nuclear annihilation multiple times, can we really say he was wrong? Because this is a forgotten operation that nearly changed history. This is the secret war plan that was so sensitive, so explosive, so unthinkable that it remained hidden for over 5 decades. And today we're going to explore every aspect of it, from Churchill's motivations to the detailed invasion plans, from the reaction of his military chiefs to the possibility that Soviet spies betrayed the entire operation, from the alternate history where this operation actually happened to the legacy it left behind that shaped the Cold War. And I promise you, by the end of this deep dive, you'll understand why this forgotten operation matters more than almost any battle that was actually fought. Because sometimes the wars we don't fight are more important than the ones we do. Stay with me, because what I'm about to reveal will change how you see World War II, the Cold War, and so now I'm staring at these declassified documents that were hidden for over half a century, documents marked with the highest level of classification, documents that Churchill himself annotated in the margins, and I'm seeing something that should make every historian's blood run cold, because what I'm witnessing isn't just a military plan gone wrong. I'm witnessing the perfect storm of circumstances that saved the world from a third world war, and the question that haunts me as I read through page after page of these military assessments is this: were we saved by wisdom or by sheer dumb luck? Because let me tell you what was happening in those critical weeks of May and June 1945, while the world celebrated victory, while soldiers believed they were finally going home. A cascade of events was unfolding that would determine whether we plunged into another global catastrophe. And it started with something Churchill hadn't anticipated: the brutal honesty of his own military commanders. You see, on June 8, 1945, just 3 weeks before the planned invasion date, the British Chiefs of Staff delivered their final assessment of Operation Unthinkable to Churchill, and what they told him must have felt like a bucket of ice water thrown in his face. They calculated that the Soviets enjoyed a superiority of approximately 3-1 in ground forces in Central Europe. That's not the kind of odds you want when you're planning a surprise attack. But it gets worse, so much worse, because the Chiefs of Staff weren't just worried about numbers. They had fought alongside the Red Army. They had seen what these soldiers were capable of. They had watched them push back the Wehrmacht from Stalingrad to Berlin. They had witnessed the brutal efficiency of Soviet combined arms tactics. And they wrote in their assessment something that should have ended the discussion right there. They said the Russians had proved themselves formidable opponents of the Germans, that they had competent commanders, adequate equipment, and an organization that, though possibly inferior by Western standards, had stood the test of total war. And here's where the military logic becomes absolutely devastating. The Chiefs of Staff pointed out that any attack on Soviet forces would rely entirely on surprise, that without the element of surprise there was no chance of success whatsoever, and they estimated that even with surprise, even with everything going perfectly, the Allies would need to achieve such a decisive defeat of Russian forces in the field that it would render it impossible for the USSR to continue the war. But what if that didn't happen? What if the Soviets did what they had done to Napoleon, what they had done to Hitler? What if they simply withdrew deeper into their vast territory, trading space for time, evacuating factories, mobilizing their enormous reserves, And what would happen then? The chiefs of staff spelled out in terrifying detail. They noted that in 1941 the Germans had reached Moscow, the Volga, and the Caucasus, but the technique of factory evacuation combined with the development of new resources had enabled the USSR to continue fighting. And they wrote these chilling words: there was virtually no limit to the distance to which it would be necessary for the Allies to penetrate into Russia in order to render further resistance impossible. Can you imagine what Churchill must have felt reading that? Can you imagine realizing that your grand plan to save Poland might result in Allied armies freezing to death somewhere between Moscow and the Urals? But here's where the perfect storm really begins to gather strength, because while Churchill was reading this devastating assessment, something extraordinary was happening on the ground in Poland, something that would haunt historians for decades. In June 1945, Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the man who had defended Moscow, the man who had orchestrated the victory at Stalingrad, the man who had just captured Berlin, suddenly ordered his Soviet forces in Poland to regroup and prepare defensive positions. Now, why would he do that? Why would a victorious commander of the Red Army suddenly switch from occupation mode to defensive preparation? And here's where we enter the realm of historical mystery that still hasn't been completely solved. Did Stalin know about Operation Unthinkable? Had Soviet intelligence penetrated Churchill's inner circle? Because we now know that the Cambridge 5, that infamous ring of British spies, including Donald Maclean, Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross, were actively passing British secrets to Moscow, and Donald Maclean in particular had access to highly classified British documents in June 1945. So let me ask you this. If you were Stalin and you learned that the British were planning a massive surprise attack on your forces for July 1st, what would you do? Wouldn't you quietly order your best commander to prepare defensive positions? Wouldn't you regroup your forces, reinforce your positions, maybe even prepare your own counteroffensive plans? And suddenly that element of surprise that the British chiefs of staff said was absolutely essential for any chance of success, suddenly that element vanishes like morning fog. But wait, there's more. Because while all this is happening, while Churchill is reading devastating military assessments and Zhukov is preparing defensive positions, another storm cloud is gathering. And this one has a mushroom shape. You see, Churchill had been counting on American support, not just American troops and American equipment, but American resolve. He believed that President Truman would understand the Soviet threat, that America would commit to a prolonged war if necessary, and he had even told his Chief of Army Staff, General Sir Alan Brooke, that if Stalin failed to listen, the United States could target Moscow, Stalingrad, and Kiev with atomic bombs. But here's what Churchill didn't know. Here's the reality that would shatter his entire plan. The atomic bomb hadn't been successfully tested yet. The Trinity test wouldn't happen until July 16th, 1945, more than 2 weeks after the planned invasion date. So Churchill was counting on a weapon that didn't yet exist, and even worse, he was counting on American commitment that was rapidly evaporating because by June 1945, American forces were already beginning to demobilize. Soldiers who had been fighting for years were being promised they could go home. Public opinion in America was war-weary. People wanted peace. They wanted their boys back. They didn't want to start another war against a country that had been their ally. And when Truman finally made it clear to Churchill that America wanted no part in Operation Unthinkable, the Prime Minister must have felt the ground crumbling beneath his feet. But the perfect storm wasn't finished yet, because there's another element that historians often overlook. The logistics of launching such an operation were absolutely staggering. Think about it. You're asking British and American forces who are already exhausted from 6 years of war to launch a surprise attack across devastated Eastern Europe. The infrastructure was destroyed. The supply lines would be impossibly long. The Soviets would have the advantage of interior lines and secure territory. And you're telling these war-weary soldiers that instead of going home, instead of celebrating victory, they're going to fight alongside freshly rearmed German Wehrmacht soldiers against their former Soviet allies. How do you think that would go? How do you maintain morale when you're asking troops to do something that seems morally and strategically insane? And here's the kicker. Even if you could somehow overcome all these obstacles, even if surprise hadn't been compromised, even if American support had been guaranteed, even if logistics could be solved, even if morale could be maintained, the British military planners had concluded that it would be beyond Allied power to win a quick but limited success. They wrote in their assessment that the Allies would be committed to a protracted war against heavy odds, and they used a word that perfectly captured the insanity of the entire enterprise. They called it hazardous, which is British military understatement for absolutely catastrophic. So what we're looking at here is a cascading failure of epic proportions. We're looking at military reality colliding with political ambition. We're looking at intelligence failures or intelligence successes depending on which side you're on. We're looking at the atomic bomb that wasn't ready, the American support that wasn't coming, the Soviet defensive preparations that may or may not have been triggered by espionage, the exhausted Allied armies, the impossible logistics, the 3-to-1 numerical disadvantage, and underlying all of it, the fundamental strategic reality that attacking the Soviet Union in their moment of victory was military madness. And yet here's what keeps me awake at night. Churchill wasn't wrong about Stalin's intentions. Everything Churchill feared about Soviet domination of Eastern Europe came true. The Iron Curtain did descend, Poland did lose its freedom, millions did suffer under communist dictatorship for nearly half a century. So was Churchill a mad warmonger for proposing Operation Unthinkable, or was he a prophet who saw the future and tried desperately to prevent it? And if Operation Unthinkable had somehow succeeded against all odds, if that perfect storm of circumstances hadn't stopped it, would we be living in a better world today, or would we be living in the radioactive ruins of a Third World War? Because that's the terrifying thing about this moment in history. We came so close to finding out, and the only thing that stopped us was a cascade of failures that in retrospect looks an awful lot like divine intervention or dumb luck, depending on your perspective. But I'm not done yet, because I need to show you exactly what would have happened if Churchill had given the order. I need to show you the alternate timeline that military planners sketched out, the timeline that explains why this operation truly was unthinkable, and then I need to show you how this secret plan, this operation that never happened, somehow shaped the entire Cold War that followed. So stay with me, because what comes next will change how you understand the world we're living in today. Now, let me show you something that should make every person who values peace and freedom fundamentally question whether we're living in the best possible timeline or whether we miss a chance to prevent 50 years of suffering. Because I've spent years studying the alternate history that military historians have mapped out, the timeline where Operation Unthinkable actually happened, where Churchill gave the order on July 1st, 1945, where those 47 Allied divisions launched their surprise attack near Dresden, and what I've discovered is simultaneously horrifying and fascinating. It's a glimpse into a world that could have been radically different from the one we know. And the question that haunts me every single day is this: would that world have been better or worse? Would millions of lives have been saved, or would civilization itself have collapsed into radioactive ruins? Because let's start with what the immediate aftermath would have looked like if Operation Unthinkable had launched. Imagine you're an American or British soldier who's been fighting since D-Day. You've just survived the Battle of Bulge. You've crossed the Rhine. You've seen the horrors of the concentration camps. You've been counting the days until you can go home to your family. And suddenly on July 1st, 1945, your commanding officer tells you that you're not going home, that instead you're attacking the Soviet Union, your former ally. And here's the truly insane part. You're going to be fighting alongside freshly rearmed German Wehrmacht soldiers, the same soldiers who were trying to kill you just weeks ago. Can you imagine the psychological impact? Can you imagine collapse of morale, the confusion, the anger, the sense of betrayal? And this isn't speculation. Military historians who studied the scenario point out that mutinies would have been almost inevitable. American soldiers, in particular, who had been promised they'd be going home after defeating Germany, would have refused to fight. There would have been massive desertions, insubordination, maybe even armed resistance against their own officers. And that's before a single shot is fired at the Soviets. But let's say somehow Churchill and Truman managed to maintain discipline. Let's say the attack actually launched. What happens next is where it gets truly terrifying, because the element of surprise that the British Chiefs of Staff said was absolutely essential. That element was almost certainly already compromised. If Soviet intelligence knew about the operation, and there's strong evidence they did, then Marshal Zhuka's defensive preparations meant that those 47 Allied divisions wouldn't be catching the Red Army off guard. They'd be walking into a meat grinder. Soviet forces would have been dug in, reinforced, ready. And remember, the Red Army had just spent 4 years perfecting the art of defensive warfare. They had stopped the Wehrmacht at Moscow, at Stalingrad. At Kursk, they knew how to absorb an attack and counterattack with devastating force. So in the opening days of Operation Unthinkable, Allied forces would have made some initial gains. Air superiority would have helped. Strategic bombing of Soviet supply lines would have disrupted their logistics. But within weeks, maybe even days, the reality of what they were facing would have become clear. The Soviets had 264 divisions in Europe. The Allies had 103. That's a 2.5 to 1 disadvantage in numbers. And these weren't untested troops. These were battle-hardened veterans who had just defeated the most powerful military machine in history. And here's where the alternate timeline gets truly apocalyptic, because by August 1945, just 1 month into the war, Allied casualties would have been staggering. We're talking about losses that would have made D-Day look like a minor engagement. Tens of thousands dead, hundreds of thousands wounded, entire divisions destroyed or routed, and the political fallout would have been immediate and catastrophic. Public opinion in America and Britain would have turned violently against the war. Churchill's government would have collapsed. There would have been massive protests, riots, demands for immediate withdrawal. But withdrawal to where? The Soviets wouldn't have stopped at defending their positions. Stalin would have seen this attack as the ultimate betrayal, as proof that the capitalist powers had always planned to destroy the Soviet Union. And he would have launched a massive counteroffensive aimed at nothing less than the complete conquest of Western Europe. Can you imagine Soviet tanks rolling through West Germany, through France, through Belgium? Imagine a Red Army reaching the Atlantic coast. Imagine Britain standing alone once again, but this time facing an enemy that controlled all of continental Europe. And now we come to the weapon that changes everything, the atomic bomb. Because by mid-August 1945, the Trinity test had succeeded, the bombs were ready, and facing catastrophic defeat in Europe, facing the prospect of Soviet domination of the entire continent, President Truman would have been under enormous pressure to use nuclear weapons, not against Japan, but against Soviet cities. And here's where the alternate timeline diverges into multiple horrifying possibilities. Let's say Truman authorizes the atomic bombing of Soviet military concentrations, maybe even Soviet cities, Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev. The production schedule that General Grove's outline showed that by September 1945, America would have had 3 or 4 atomic bombs, by October 4 or 5, by November at least 5, by December 7, and the numbers would have increased dramatically into 1946, potentially reaching over 100 bombs by the end of that year. So imagine a scenario where throughout late 1945 and into 1946, American B-29 bombers are systematically dropping atomic bombs on Soviet targets. The death toll would have been in the millions. Entire cities vaporized, the radioactive fallout spreading across Eastern Europe and into Western Europe, contaminating farmland, poisoning water supplies, creating humanitarian catastrophe that would have made the Holocaust look like a prelude. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. Would it have worked? Would Stalin have surrendered? Or would he have done what he always did? Trade space for time. Evacuate his government and military command to the Urals or beyond. Mobilize the vast reserves of manpower from Siberia and Central Asia. And prepare for prolonged war of attrition that could have lasted years. And remember, Japan hadn't surrendered yet in this timeline. Because without the atomic bombs being used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Pacific War would still be raging. American forces would have been fighting on 2 fronts, against Japan and against the Soviet Union. And the logistics of that scenario are absolutely nightmarish. American industrial capacity, as vast as it was, couldn't sustain 2 total wars simultaneously. Something would have to give. And here's another terrifying possibility. What if Stalin, facing nuclear annihilation, had managed to accelerate his own atomic bomb program? The Soviets tested their first atomic bomb in August 1949 in our timeline. But if they had been facing an existential threat from American nuclear weapons, if Soviet scientists had been given unlimited resources and told that the survival of the Soviet Union depended on developing a bomb as quickly as possible, could they have done it by 1946 or 1947? The war ended with Allied victory. What would that world look like? Poland would be free. That's what Churchill wanted. Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, all of Eastern Europe would have been liberated not by Soviet tanks, but by Allied forces. There would be no Iron Curtain, no Berlin Wall, no Cold War, at least not in the form we know it. Millions of people who suffered under communist dictatorships for nearly 5 decades would have been spared that suffering. There would have been no Korean War, no Vietnam War, no Cuban Missile Crisis, no decades of nuclear brinkmanship that brought humanity to the edge of extinction multiple times. The entire second half of the 20th century would have been fundamentally different. But at what cost? How many millions would have died in the war itself? How many cities would have been destroyed? How much of Europe would have been reduced to radioactive wasteland? And here's the question that military historians still debate. Could the Allies actually have won? The consensus among most serious historians is no. The odds were simply too great. The Soviet advantages in numbers, in defensive position, in strategic depth were overwhelming, even with air superiority, even with atomic bombs. The most likely outcome would have been a protracted stalemate that devolved into either a negotiated peace that left both sides exhausted and Europe in ruins, or an escalation into full nuclear war that could have ended civilization. And here's what really makes this missed opportunity so haunting. Churchill might have been right about Stalin's intentions. Everything Churchill feared came true. The Soviet Union did dominate Eastern Europe for 50 years, did crush freedom and democracy wherever it could, did engage in proxy wars around the world that killed millions, did build a nuclear arsenal that threatened human extinction. The Cold War that followed was itself a kind of slow-motion catastrophe that shaped global politics for half a century. So when we talk about the missed opportunity, what are we really talking about? Are we talking about missing the chance to prevent Soviet domination and save Eastern Europe from communism? Or are we talking about narrowly avoiding a third world war that would have been worse than anything that came before? And the brutal truth is that we'll never know for certain. We can map out the possibilities. We can study the military assessments. We can analyze the alternate timelines. But we can't know what would have really happened. We can't know if Operation Unthinkable would have succeeded or failed. We can't know if it would have saved millions or killed millions. We can't know if we'd be living in a better world today or if we'd be living in the ruins of civilization. And maybe that uncertainty is the real lesson here. Maybe the fact that Operation Unthinkable remained unthinkable, that cooler heads prevailed, that the devastating military assessments convinced Churchill that the risks were too great. Maybe that was the right decision. Maybe avoiding that war, even though it meant accepting 50 years of Cold War tension, even though it meant abandoning Eastern Europe to Soviet domination. Maybe that was a lesser evil. Or maybe we really did miss our one chance to stop Stalin when it was still possible, when the West still had overwhelming military superiority, before the Soviets developed their own atomic bomb, before they became a superpower that could match American strength. Maybe Churchill was right, and we've been living with the consequences of that missed opportunity ever since. And the terrifying thing is that both possibilities could be true. Maybe avoiding Operation Unthinkable saved us from immediate catastrophe, but condemned us to decades of Cold War suffering. Maybe there was no good choice, only the choice between different kind of tragedy. And as I look at the documents, as I read the military assessments, as I study the alternate timelines, I keep coming back to one fundamental question. If you had been in Churchill's position, if you had been the one making the decision, knowing everything he knew, fearing everything he feared, what would you have done? Would you have ordered the attack despite the odds, despite the risks, despite the certainty of massive casualties, in the hope of preventing 50 years of Soviet tyranny? Or would you have done what Churchill ultimately did, accept the military assessment, abandon the plan, and hope that somehow, some way, the Cold War that followed would be less catastrophic than the hot war you avoided? Because that's what makes this forgotten operation so important. It's not just about what didn't happen. It's about the impossible choices that leaders face when there are no good options, when every path forward leads to tragedy, when the question isn't how to win, but how to minimize the losing, and in the end, maybe the real reason Operation Unthinkable remained a secret for over 50 years is that it forced us to confront the most uncomfortable truth about World War II and its aftermath, that we didn't win clean, that victory over Nazi Germany didn't bring peace and freedom to all of Europe, that we had to choose between fighting our former ally and accepting Soviet domination, and that whichever choice we made, millions would suffer. But this forgotten operation that nearly changed history, this plan that was so dangerous, so audacious, so unthinkable that it couldn't even be spoken of publicly, this operation shaped everything that came after, even though it never happened, because Stalin knew or suspected or fear that the West might turn on him, and that fear shaped Soviet policy for the entire Cold War. It shaped the Iron Curtain, the Berlin blockade, the arms race. Every aggressive move Stalin made was partly driven by the paranoia that what Churchill had planned might still happen. So in a twisted way, Operation Unthinkable did change history, not by happening, but by almost happening, not by succeeding, but by existing. And now as we move into the final part of this deep dive, I need to show you how the secret plan that was deliberately buried, this operation that was classified for over 5 decades, this forgotten chapter of history, somehow became one of the most important influences on the Cold War that defined the second half of the 20th century, because the story doesn't end with Churchill abandoning the plan. It continues in the shadows, in the paranoia, in the nuclear standoffs, in the proxy wars, in every moment when the world teetered on the edge of World War III. And understanding Operation Unthinkable is the key to understanding all of it. So stay with me for this final chapter, because I'm about to reveal how a war that never happened shaped the peace that never was. So here's what haunts me about this entire story. Here's what keeps me awake at night long after I close the files and turn off the lights in the archive. It's not just that Operation Unthinkable almost happened. It's not just that we came within weeks of a third world war that could have ended civilization. What truly terrifies me is that this operation, this plan that was so dangerous and so explosive that it had to be buried for over half a century, was deliberately hidden from history. And when I say deliberately, I mean with the full weight and authority of the British government. Because let me tell you exactly what happened to these documents, how they disappeared, how they were concealed, and why their eventual revelation in 1998 changed everything we thought we knew about the Cold War. Because this isn't just a story about a military operation that never happened. This is a story about how governments control historical narratives, about how secrets shape the world even when they remain secret, and about how the paranoia and fear generated by Operation Unthinkable became the foundation for 50 years of nuclear brinkmanship. So let me start with the cover-up itself, because it's actually quite extraordinary when you think about it. In 1972, 27 years after the war ended, the British government began releasing World War II documents to what was then called the Public Records Office. Thousands upon thousands of files were declassified, military. Historians and researchers descended on the archives like locusts, eager to piece together the complete story of the war. And among those files was a folder belonging to the Joint Planning Staff, the same group that had been tasked during the war with devising all sorts of contingency plans. And researchers looking through this folder found a memorandum listing various war plans. And here's where it gets interesting. Several of those plans were marked as withdrawn. There were blank spaces, reference numbers that led nowhere. And when researchers started asking questions, when they said, wait a minute, what are these missing plans? What's been withdrawn? The Cabinet Office, which controls the release of sensitive government documents, stonewalled them completely. They refused to comment. They insisted there was no plan. They claimed the researchers were chasing shadows. And this went on for 26 years. Can you imagine that for a quarter of a century, historians knew something was missing? They could see the gaps in the official record. They'd heard rumors about an operation with an ominous code name, Operation Unthinkable, but they couldn't prove it existed. And the British government simply denied everything. And then suddenly, without warning, in 1998, 53 years after the operation was conceived, the documents appeared, just like that. They materialized in the Public Records Office, now called the National Archives, with the reference number CAB-120/691. No explanation, no press release, no acknowledgement that they had been deliberately withheld for decades. They just showed up one day as if they had been there all along. And when researchers finally got their hands on these documents, when they read Churchill's orders and the military assessments and the invasion plans, they realized why the British government had been so desperate to keep them secret. Because these documents revealed something absolutely explosive. They revealed that Churchill, the great wartime leader, the man who had stood up to Hitler, the hero of Western democracy, had seriously considered attacking the Soviet Union just weeks after the defeat of Nazi Germany, using British and American and even German troops to launch a surprise assault on our former ally. And the political implications of that revelation were staggering, because if Operation Unthinkable had become public knowledge during the Cold War, if people had known in the 1950s or 1960s or 1970s, that Churchill had planned to attack the Soviet Union in 1945. How would that have changed the narrative of who started the Cold War? How would it have affected Western claims that we were the innocent victims of Soviet aggression? How would it have played in the court of international opinion when we were trying to maintain our alliances and justify our military buildups? The answer is it would have been a propaganda disaster of epic proportions. Stalin would have pointed to Operation Unthinkable as proof that the West had always intended to destroy the Soviet Union, that Soviet paranoia and defensive posturing were completely justified, that the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall and all the aggressive Soviet actions were necessary responses to Western hostility. And suddenly the moral clarity of the Cold War, the idea that we were the good guys defending freedom against totalitarian aggression, suddenly all of that becomes murky and complicated. So the British government buried it. They classified it at the highest level. They refused to release it even when other World War II documents were being declassified, and they kept it hidden until 1998, 7 years after the Soviet Union collapsed, 7 years after the Cold War ended, when finally the political cost of revelation was minimal. But here's the thing that's even more disturbing. While the British government was denying that Operation Unthinkable existed, while they were keeping these documents locked away, Stalin knew, or at least he strongly suspected. And the reason he knew brings us to one of the most fascinating and chilling aspects of this entire story. The Cambridge Five, specifically Guy Burgess, one of the most successful and audacious Soviet spies who ever operated. Because Burgess wasn't just any spy. He was a member of the British establishment, educated at Eton and Cambridge, charming and well-connected, a man who moved in the highest circles of British government and intelligence. And in early 1945, Burgess was working as a press officer in the Foreign Office News Department, which gave him access to highly sensitive policy documents. And according to declassified KGB files, Burgess handed over 389 top-secret documents to his Soviet handlers in the first half of 1945 alone. 389 documents in 6 months. That's more than 2 documents per day, and among those documents, almost certainly, were details about Operation Unthinkable. We know this because when the operation was being planned in May and June 1945, Burgess had access to Foreign Office materials. He saw telegrams, he saw policy papers, he saw classified assessments, and his job was literally to be informed about British foreign policy. So he could explain to journalists and diplomats. So it's almost inconceivable that he wouldn't have seen something about Operation Unthinkable, or at least heard about it through his extensive network of contacts. And if he saw it, he would have passed it to Moscow immediately. Because think about what that information would have meant to Stalin. Think about receiving intelligence that Churchill was planning a surprise attack on Soviet forces scheduled for July 1st, 1945, just weeks away. And suddenly all those mysterious British actions started to make sense. The stockpiling of German weapons, the reluctance to disband German military units, the defensive preparations that Marshal Zhukov suddenly ordered in June 1945. Everything fits together if you assume Stalin knew or strongly suspected what Churchill was planning. And this brings us to the terrible irony at the heart of Operation Unthinkable's legacy. The operation never happened. Churchill was convinced by his military chiefs that it was too risky, that the odds were too great, that it would lead to protracted war against overwhelming odds. So he shelved the plan, but the Soviet Union's knowledge of the plan, or their strong suspicion that such a plan existed, that shaped everything that came after. Because Stalin's paranoia about Western intentions wasn't entirely paranoia. It was based on a very real fact that Churchill had seriously considered attacking the Soviet Union. And when you look at Soviet actions in the immediate post-war period, the aggressive consolidation of control over Eastern Europe, the Berlin blockade of 1948, the development of Soviet nuclear weapons, the creation of the Iron Curtain, all of it can be understood at least partly as Stalin's response to the perceived threat represented by Operation Unthinkable. He believed, probably correctly, that the West wanted to destroy the Soviet Union, that the alliance during World War II had been purely tactical, and that as soon as Germany was defeated, the Western powers would turn on their former ally. So he acted accordingly. He built a buffer zone of satellite states in Eastern Europe. He rushed to develop his own atomic bomb, which the Soviets successfully tested in August 1949. He prepared for the war he believed was coming, and in doing so, he created the exact confrontation that Churchill had feared, the Cold War that followed, with its nuclear standoffs and proxy wars and constant threat of global annihilation, was in many ways a result of Operation Unthinkable. Not because the operation happened, but because it almost happened, because it existed, because Stalin knew about it. And that's what makes this forgotten operation so important to understanding the Cold War. It wasn't just a contingency plan that got filed away. It was a psychological weapon that poisoned relations between East and West for decades. And when we look at the major crises of the Cold War, we can see Operation Unthinkable's shadow, the Korean War that broke out in 1950, just 5 years after Operation Unthinkable was conceived, can be understood partly as Stalin testing Western resolve, seeing how far he could push before the West would actually attack. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when the world came closer to nuclear war than at any time before or since, was a direct result of Soviet paranoia about American intentions, the same paranoia that had been stoked by Churchill's plan to attack in 1945. The nuclear arms race that consumed trillions of dollars and created enough weapons to destroy human civilization multiple times over. That was driven by mutual fear and suspicion that had its roots in the breakdown of trust in 1945. And throughout all of this, for 50 years, the British government kept Operation Unthinkable secret. They denied it existed, they refused to release the documents, and by doing so, they prevented historians and the public from understanding one of the key factors that shaped the Cold War. And that's what I mean when I talk about how governments control historical narratives. Because the official story of the Cold War, the story that was taught in schools and presented in the media, was that Soviet aggression forced the West to respond, that Stalin was the villain, and we were the victims, that the West had no choice but to build up military forces and create NATO and station troops across Europe. And there's truth to that story. Stalin was indeed a brutal dictator who enslaved Eastern Europe and killed millions. But it's not the whole truth, because the whole truth includes Operation Unthinkable. It includes Churchill's plan to attack the Soviet Union. It includes the Western betrayal of our wartime ally. And when you include those facts, the narrative becomes more complex, more nuanced, less morally clear-cut, and that complexity is what the British government wanted to avoid. So now let me tell you what happened when the documents were finally released in 1998. Because the reaction from historians and military strategists was fascinating, some argue that Operation Unthinkable proved Churchill was right all along, that it correctly identified the Soviet threat before anyone else, that his willingness to consider military action showed strategic foresight, that if we had attacked in 1945, when we had overwhelming military and nuclear superiority, we could have prevented 50 years of Cold War suffering. Others argued the exact opposite, that Operation Unthinkable was proof of Churchill's recklessness, that attacking the Soviet Union in 1945 would have been military and moral insanity, that would have resulted in millions of deaths and possibly the destruction of European civilization, that the decision not to proceed was one of the wisest strategic choices of the 20th century, and both sides had valid points. And that's what makes Operation Unthinkable such a perfect case study for understanding the impossible choices that leaders face in moments of crisis. Because Churchill wasn't wrong about Stalin, everything he feared came true. The Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, the suppression of freedom, the threat to Western security, all of it happened exactly as Churchill predicted. But Churchill's military chiefs weren't wrong either when they told him that attacking the Soviet Union would be catastrophic, that it would result in a protracted war against overwhelming odds, that even with surprise and air superiority and atomic bombs, the chances of success were minimal. So what do you do when both options lead to tragedy? When the choice is between accepting evil or fighting a war that might destroy civilization? That's the question Churchill faced. And it's a question that's defined in Nuclear Age, and modern military strategists who have studied Operation Unthinkable have drawn important lessons from it. They've learned that military planning must be based on realistic assessments rather than political desires, that surprise attacks against nuclear-armed opponents are essentially impossible in the modern era, that alliance management and maintaining coalition unity are often more important than military superiority, that the moral and political costs of preventive war are usually too high to justify, except in the most extreme circumstances. And perhaps most importantly, they've learned that the wars we don't fight can be just as consequential as the wars we do. Because Operation Unthinkable shaped the Cold War even though it never happened. It shaped Soviet strategy. It shaped Western defense policy. It shaped the nuclear arms race. It shaped everything. And that brings me to the final and perhaps most important legacy of Operation Unthinkable, the lesson about transparency and historical truth. Because the British government's decision to hide these documents for over 50 years had consequences, it prevented us from having an honest conversation about the origins of the Cold War. It allowed myths and oversimplifications to dominate our understanding of history. It meant that important strategic lessons couldn't be learned because the full story wasn't available, and when secrets are kept that long, when governments control access to historical information, we lose the ability to learn from the past. We lose the ability to make informed decisions about the future. We lose the ability to hold our leaders accountable for their actions and their decisions. So when I look at Operation Unthinkable, when I study these documents that were hidden for so long, I'm not just seeing a military plan that was never executed. I'm seeing a microcosm of everything that was wrong with Cold War secrecy, the paranoia, the mistrust, the manipulation of historical narratives, the refusal to acknowledge complexity and nuance. And I'm also seeing something hopeful, because eventually the truth did come out. The documents were released. Historians could finally piece together the complete story, and we learned from it. We learned about the dangers of preventive war. We learned about the importance of alliance management. We learned about the unintended consequences of military planning. We learned that sometimes the right decision is to not fight, even when fighting seems morally justified. And as I sit here now, looking at these declassified documents, reading Churchill's annotations in the margins, studying the military assessments, examining the alternate timelines that never happened, I realize that Operation Unthinkable is still relevant today because we're still making these same choices. We're still facing situations where military action seems justified, but the consequences are unpredictable. We're still dealing with authoritarian powers that threaten our values and our security. We're still asking ourselves whether it's better to act preemptively or to wait and hope for the best. And Operation Unthinkable reminds us that there are no easy answers, that sometimes every choice leads to tragedy, that the burden of leadership in a nuclear age is almost unbearable. But it also reminds us that transparency matters, that historical truth matters, that we need to know the full story, even the parts that are uncomfortable or morally ambiguous, because only by understanding what actually happened, what was actually planned, what was actually considered, can we hope to make better decisions in the future. And that's why this forgotten operation matters. Not because it happened, but because it almost happened. Not because it changed history, but because it nearly changed history. And the fact that it remained hidden for so long, the fact that governments felt the need to conceal it, tells us something profound about the nature of power and secrecy and historical truth. So as I close these files, as I turn off the lights in the archive, as I walk out into the present day with all its new crises and new choices, I carry with me the lessons of Operation Unthinkable. I carry the knowledge that sometimes the right choice is a choice not made, that sometimes wisdom looks like cowardice and cowardice looks like wisdom, that sometimes we avoid catastrophe not through brilliant strategy but through sheer dumb luck or divine intervention, or the simple fact that reasonable people prevailed over ideological zealots. And most importantly, I carry the conviction that we need to know these stories. We need to understand the forgotten operations, these almost wars, these near misses of annihilation, because they shaped our world just as surely as the events that actually occurred. And if we forget them, if we allow them to remain buried in classified archives, if we accept the simplified narratives that governments prefer, then we lose something essential. We lose our ability to learn from history. And that's the real tragedy. Not the war that almost happened, but the lessons. We almost didn't learn. And that's why I'm telling you this story today. That's why Operation Unthinkable matters 79 years after Churchill conceived it. Because we're still living in the world it created. We're still dealing with the consequences of decisions made in 1945. We're still trying to figure out how to prevent wars while maintaining peace, how to stand up to tyranny without destroying civilization, how to make impossible choices when every option leads to suffering. And the only guide we have is history. The only wisdom we can draw on is the experience of those who came before us. The only hope we have of making better choices is understanding the choices that were made and the choices that were almost made but weren't. So remember Operation Unthinkable. Remember Churchill's impossible decision. Remember the war that almost was. Remember the cover-up that lasted 50 years. Remember the lessons that almost remain buried forever, because in a world that still teeters on the edge of catastrophe, In an age when nuclear weapons still threaten human existence, in a time when authoritarian powers still challenge democratic values, we need these lessons more than ever. We need to remember that sometimes the greatest victories are the wars we don't fight, and sometimes the most important thing a leader can do is to listen when their advisors say no, even when everything inside them is screaming yes. And that's the legacy of Operation Unthinkable. That's a forgotten operation that nearly changed history. And now you know the truth that was hidden for over 50 years. The truth that shaped the Cold War even though it remained secret. The truth that reminds us that history is never as simple as we think, that heroes make terrible mistakes, that villains sometimes have valid reasons for their paranoia, and that the line between wisdom and folly is often invisible until decades have passed, and we can finally see the full picture. So thank you for staying with me through this deep dive. Thank you for confronting these uncomfortable truths. And remember, the next time someone tells you a simple story about good guys and bad guys, about heroes and villains, about the way things really were, remember Operation Unthinkable. Remember that the truth is always more complex than the official narrative. And remember that sometimes the most important stories are the ones that almost happened but didn't, because those are the stories that shaped our world just as surely as the events we commemorate and celebrate and put in our history books.